Hello and welcome to the Auditing Antics Podcast. Today we have episode 18, where we're going to be diving more into risk adjustment and, some of the topics that are really being talked about a lot right now with the rise of government audits and the different notifications we've had around those types of reviews that we can expect to be happening very soon. Now, Michelle's not in the studio with us today. She is still settling in. She recently purchased her new home. So it's been nice to, have her settle in, get used to her new area near our parents, all of that in Florida. So today it's going to be me, and Michelle will be back in the studio with us next week. Now, when it comes to risk adjustment, there's a lot of things that I'm seeing just really mainly on LinkedIn and the different activity that's coming about with the announcement from the government and, OIG, HHS, all of these different entities that they're going to be focusing more on risk adjustment. And there's been a really large focus on what that means for our Medicare Advantage plans. But one of the things that we need to really be breaking down and thinking about more specifically is how this is going to also transfer over to provider practices, hospital facilities. We definitely have situations with groups like an ACO, for example, that largely is submitting value-based data that this is going to impact as well. So, we really need to make sure that we're understanding not only what's happening in the industry, but what that means for us personally and what we need to start doing about that. Now, one of the things that I've found interesting, just related to everything that's coming out, and this is just going to be me talking openly for a minute here. I've seen a lot of buzz on different Facebook groups, for example, different private medical coding groups, where there's a lot of people that are actively applying and trying to get these jobs quickly. And there seems to be a very high volume of these jobs coming out. And I was just messaging with my friend Terry Fletcher last week about this because I was saying to her, I wonder how many of these openings are related to the fact that, the government says they're going to staff, I think, around 2,000 new auditors or coders by September, something like that. So the reason I'm bringing this up and the reason I'm talking about it is these companies that are getting contracts. And again, this is just my assumption that it's around this because I don't know how else there would be such a high push with everybody going to these, two main companies that I've seen identified in these private pages. But it's interesting because they are specifically targeting people that have the apprenticeship with zero experience. And I bring that up because we in the industry as a whole are getting ready and starting to see what the repercussions are going to be, meaning it's going to eventually affect our fee for service claims in one way or another. It also can affect things like the administrative burden. We're going to see an increase in people that are having to provide additional documentation for this verification. And I say all of this because it's concerning to me that the companies that are getting these large contracts, again, assumptions, but the signs seem to be there. They're getting these large contracts and they're bringing in people with zero experience. This is something that takes a lot of knowledge and detail to be able to go through. And I know how a lot of these companies work. Sadly, sometimes what they do is they hire people with little to no experience, and then they give them all this information, they overload them, and then it's on the person to sink or swim. I also don't like that. I'm a huge advocate in this industry for people who are new and upcoming, from an experience level, from a mentorship level. And for me, just getting some kind of experience really isn't the best when you're looking at something as a full career, basically. But that's a whole other issue that I'm not going to get into today. But I say this because we're seeing these organizations that are starting to staff. And, what is that outcome going to be? They're going to be looking at documentation for the payers. But again, this is all going to trickle down to the providers. And there's a lot of nuances that come into that. But I wanted to start that discussion just to kind of get it out here on this platform where we can start to have open discussions about that. I do think that this means we're going to have to be very diligent in what we're seeing. So, for example, if we have different repercussions coming down the line to provider practices, you also need to have things in place to make sure that what they're saying or what they may be accusing of in the future is accurate as well. We don't know what's going to be coming out of this. There's many situations that we deal with in the industry where there are insurance payer external audits done on practices, and we see a lot of issues with the output of their findings. So I say that because I want everyone to be aware that we need to be ready for this. We need to be preparing for this. And don't just assume that because you don't see immediate reimbursement on this particular area of the industry, that you're going to let this all happen in the background. Because I think to some extent, you're going to regret that if that's what you end up doing and that's the route that you take. So, in general, we need to think about what the different areas are that we need to focus on, right? So, being ready, being audit ready, paying attention to our own compliance. And, one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot lately, even more so in 2025, is that I do meet a lot of organizations who need audit services. But there's many times that after we go through like a discovery process, for example, or just have a quick discussion, they pretty much ultimately, when they go to their CFO or whoever from the administrative decision is going to be making the decision to move forward with external audits, a lot of them will back down and say, oh, well, we don't want to do that right now. And, I know we talk about this all the time on this podcast. And when I'm on Compliance Guy with Sean Weiss, I know my friend Terry Fletcher talks about it a lot on her podcast as well. But it is so important to have this external input. Right now, the environment that we're in the industry, again, you can't just hide and wait for it to be your turn to have these different audits that are done. And I say this because in my personal experience, when I'm going in and doing compliance audits for practices, I do to some extent look at even the fee for service claims with a little bit of a lens from a risk adjustment perspective. So what I mean by that is when I'm looking at documentation and I see that the patient has hypertension and renal failure, let's say stage 4, and I see that I-10 is billed for the hypertension, that's sticking out like a sore thumb, like that provider did not combine that diagnosis. And there's constantly issues related to the specificity of the diagnoses that are being selected and billed out. There's also still a lot of continued issues around the use of the EMR systems. And organizations need to realize that tools are built into these systems, but it's up to you to monitor and make sure that you are adhering to the compliance side of things. And I got to meet with Dr. Kush Singh this morning. He's going to be coming on the podcast in a couple of weeks. And he has an amazing platform that he's built from an AI perspective, a tech perspective, a very large focus on quality-based services. And that's what we'll be talking about when he comes on. But one of the things that he said to me this morning was spot on. And it's the fact that organizations do not realize that when these developers are coming in and making these tools, that's what it is. They're not there. They're not going to stay there and babysit you after you bring in a particular tool or use a particular EMR system. I do have my own frustrations at times when we find that we have these different EMR companies, for example, that don't seem to have a very large focus on the compliance side, or at least not in the way that we would want to see that from a coding and billing perspective, right? But ultimately, it is the organization's responsibility to oversee this. And, it's another area that constantly that ball is dropped. So I bring all of that up because even when I'm doing my fee for service auditing, I very commonly find that I go into the assessment and plan in a progress note, and all we see is a list of diagnoses. We see a couple of treatment options that are listed that are pairing with some of those diagnoses, but largely there is still a huge misunderstanding in the industry that from the provider perspective, us in compliance are just asking them to get as many conditions on a claim as possible. And those of us that work in this every day, we know that that's not what we're looking for. It actually does more harm than good. It doesn't help a level of service from an E&M perspective, and it's really going to hurt the process going forward with risk adjustment. So bringing that thought back around to the discussion with external audits and things like that. You may think in your organization, whether you're a small practice, a large multi-specialty outpatient practice, hospital facility, you may think that you're still going to sit under the radar, but I think we're going to see more and more that you are also going to be held accountable if you continue to allow these bad habits to happen in your organizations without that proper oversight, without the investment of, proper audit monitoring and things like that. So we need to make sure that internally it's being watched with that external eye. Again, that's something where somebody can come in like myself and say, hey, you have all of these disconnects. And a lot of times I will work with people in a compliance department or a coding department. They know 100% what the deficiencies are, but they can't get other people higher up in that organization to listen to them enough to make a true change or hold people accountable. So that is really going to be huge. It's always been huge. But the people who keep trying to skirt away from it and thinking that, it's on the back burner, we have other things to worry about, I think that's going to become harder and harder for organizations to act in that particular way. Now, when it comes to the documentation, the coding side, everything that relates to risk adjustment and what we're going to be seeing here. So remember that with risk adjustment, yes, the data is coming from the ICD-10 and the diagnoses that are going out on your fee for service claims, but we still have that responsibility within the notes and within the really the accuracy of that information. And, a lot of people forget that when a claim goes out the door with the provider's information on that, that is actually attesting to the fact that that information is accurate, it's supported in documentation. It's a lot more than just saying, oh, a provider selected some things in a note and put it out the door, or a coder looked at it and validated it and submitted the claim. It really holds a lot of weight or a lot of risk to that. And it's the beginning point of the entire process of risk adjustment. If we don't have that patient encounter, we don't have that face-to-face visit with that patient with the corresponding documentation, then we don't have grounds for risk adjustment. And there are a lot of other things that go into the data that is used, but this is a large component of it, and it's resting on our providers, basically. So one of the things to keep in mind, and one of the things I'm actually seeing more and more as I meet more people in this industry, is that we have situations where technology is being used. So, what I mean by that is on the payer side, they have tech that's able to look at data only. So, if you're submitting certain diagnoses, they can look at those combinations. It can compare to active ICD-10 guidelines, the different instructional notes that we have. There's capabilities of comparing to information across a span of time, for example, a comparison, if you will. So what that's doing is it's going to make it easier and easier for these organizations or these payers to come back to the provider level and say, look, at you are submitting this stuff over to us, If you think about the volume, it is absolutely impossible for them to validate every single diagnosis code coming through their system. So they're ramping up their monitoring in ways to look into this. And with the government being as aggressive as they are and, as vocal as they are publicly about their plans to come in and audit this particular area, again, we've got to think about what we're going to do on our side. So, when we think about data, for example, I had just described where, from an auditing perspective, we can see when specificity is not enough. But we need to think about other ways that monitoring can be done internally. And, one of the things that is unfortunate is that on the provider side, we don't always have those same tools available that a payer may have that they're looking over us with. So we have to think about, okay, who is going to start looking over this internally? Even having external audits done, usually those are done about one time a year or more if there are, very high error rates in those findings. So there still has to be internal plans as well to be looking at this, and education, not only for coding staff, compliance, auditing, you need that for your providers as well. So we need to be thinking about what we can do from a high level overview to maybe run different reports and take a look at practices individually or specialties individually. Start really playing around inside of probably your practice management system where you can see that claims data, and look to see where you can start identifying some of these gaps or concerns just with that manual oversight and look. Then you can start targeting in a little more specifically. Now, one of the things that I've also found interesting in the different projects that I've been working on lately is that with the increase of things like audits or anything within the compliance and regulatory side of the industry, it does transfer additional burden, to be honest, onto the providers. And I'm really finding that I'm receiving more and more pushback. And whether it's me personally with a particular client, or sometimes I work with other individuals that are in maybe a legal position or clinical quality, different leadership positions, and we're also as a group receiving pushback. And sometimes just flat out disrespect from physicians, APP practitioners that are frustrated with the system. One of the things that is also going to be very important is that there is a group that is representing different positions or different interests within the company that is going before your organization and talking about why this is so important. It's one of those things where this isn't going to be optional. Last week I had a physician who was really mad, and he's like, well, I don't want to do what you're saying I have to do, so I'm just going to leave it and I'm not even going to complete that note for the patient. Okay, well, that's not reasonable on any level. And, I know it's out of frustration, but there's so many other concerns other than just what I'm looking at heavily on the coding side with a physician stating something like that. When you look at the legal side, the potential for malpractice, the continuity of care, all of these things come into play, and they're just mad because there's changes to try to mitigate the level of risks that are really open inside the organization. And honestly, a lot of times that risk can exist due to that provider behavior. So, a large part of what I'm finding that we really need to incorporate into monitoring of different items is a bucket related to provider behavior. And I don't say that in a way where I think that all the time across the board, all the physicians and APPs I work with do this. But I have been surprised and really disappointed at the amount of times that I'm seeing this reaction to different compliance workflows that are being put into place. Sometimes when there's different features being built into EMR systems to help with all of these things that really are not optional, right? So whether they like it or not, there's got to be a way to address this. So I say all of that because when we have these discussions and when we look at education, it needs to be not only compliance coming in and saying, well, you're not doing these things. You have to do that because I said so. That doesn't work. It doesn't work with our kids. If we try that with parenting, it doesn't work with anyone that you're trying to have a productive and hopefully respectful conversation or session with. So it's really important for them to understand the why behind everything that's being done. I find a lot of times with risk adjustment, the problem is that because they don't always receive direct reimbursement from this process, especially if they're not in an ACO or any other kind of managed group like that, they really don't understand why they have to care about it or what could potentially happen as far as the outcome. So we need to make sure compliance is there. I really personally prefer as well, usually when I'm working with clients, there is some kind of contact available from the administrative side that is typically a physician. So a lead physician, someone who's in an administrative role who can really help to bridge that gap. And, it is important as well when these different things go on. I do want to say it is important to hear the frustrations. It doesn't change the outcome, but the providers that are involved in this, they need to know that they're being heard. Sometimes, at times, there's different things that can be done to alleviate what their frustrations are. Maybe it's a workflow and there's another process that can be shown to them to help the workflow. Sometimes from an education standpoint, we can help them narrow down instead of saying all diagnoses have to be specific. Sometimes we can narrow that down and start giving them a smaller area to focus on, maybe based on their patient population, different things like that. But we need to remember that when we work on the education part internally, we don't only go with information. We have to go with solutions as well, or at least suggestions and being open to discussing what a solution is. But at the end of the day, if there are providers that, have those reactions like I had last week, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that they are that angry. It still has to be done. I understand that in this industry, it's become incredibly burdensome for them. They didn't get into this field to say, oh, I want to document the way that Stephanie says I have to, or I want to submit these codes because Stephanie told us we have to. Nobody comes into the industry thinking that from that clinical perspective. They want to treat their patients. They want that focus to be on that clinical management of that patient. And this is just that necessary side of it that is just growing and growing and growing. So we have to make sure there's a balance there. We have to keep people in line if they choose to act out and not stay within the boundaries. You have to look at what that risk is doing. Another thing that can be difficult is when I'm working with organizations and that from the administrative level, they're always giving into what the physicians and the APPs want. So what I mean by that is there's not a heavy balance between the clinical side of things and then the regulatory side with compliance. That can be very dangerous. If you have the clinical piece that is heavily giving their insight just on their own clinical workflows, we know that that does not transfer over equally into compliance, coding, and billing. So we have to make sure, again, that everybody's coming to that table. We fully understand why this needs to be done. And you really have to implement plans to watch over this inside of your own organization. Now, one of the things that I find that can be helpful is, of course, looking at things like the guidelines first. So, with risk adjustment, it does go hand in hand with fee for service for the most part, because think about it, with fee for service, our presenting problems, those are not going to be counted unless we have proof that the provider is personally monitoring that condition, managing that condition. We can see the thought process of how it's playing into their decisions. If you can't see that information, you also should not be reporting that for risk adjustment. So there's ways that you can find these common threads to help try to bring this together while you're still trying to increase the accuracy, the compliance as it relates to the ICD-10 codes. Now, I would be really interested to hear if any of you all are currently receiving an increase in claim denials, for example. I know I give this example a lot when I'm doing my webinar presentations, but I've had clients that more so are receiving more denials on their entire claims because diagnoses are not accurate enough, or the combination of diagnoses is not correct when I dig in and look at things like the excludes notes or the different guidelines that are associated with the categories or the specific code. So we want to make sure that, again, as a part of monitoring, you can also be watching that back end, and you really need to be watching the back end. Another thing I'm curious about is if we're going to see an increase of, requests for documentation at the time that the claim is submitted. Maybe that's going to be happening, prior to receiving reimbursement. But it's really becoming a large issue, and too many people are not paying attention and getting in front of it. So we need to continue to talk about this. We need to continue to get the word out. It's not just a matter of hearing that, the government's increasing auditors, or they say auditors. I don't like to say an auditor, because if we have coders with zero experience, that's not an auditor. But we have reviewers that are being ramped up in these organizations, and we need to watch. We need to be careful. Pam said here that she's seeing that all the time, especially with Humana, United Healthcare, Blue Cross Blue Shield. Yeah. Yeah, because if you think about it too, especially with these organizations, look at United Healthcare. We already know that there's a microscope on them. They were already looking at this before their large, HIPAA breach last year, which they handled horribly and decimated the entire system. So, when we look at things like that, we know that that's going to trickle down. They're not just going to sit there and take it. And one of the things that I wonder, as well as we look at this in the future, what the impact is going to be, or how harsh it's going to be from the government to the payers when they find problems, because I'm certain they're going to find issues, because we know that they exist based on everything I've talked about in this episode. So, we talked about on Monday on Sean's podcast, The Compliance Guy, we did the roundtable, and we talked about the fact that, okay, they will have, fees that they have to pay, or their penalties they have to pay that are going to be so many million. But when they have billions of dollars in profits every year, is that really going to affect them enough that they care enough to make changes? I think that there's enough focus being put on this now where that may force some of their hand in that. But the reality is that there's a ton of profit in this space. We see the payers doing lots of things to gain more patients in this area, so that they can obtain the money from the government for this. So, there's a lot that has to be done from that audit perspective, that accountability perspective of these payers. But don't think that that's not going to come down to you all. So leave a comment if you have something that you've been dealing with recently in this space as far as these claim denials. I would love to see more conversations, especially on social media, starting to take place where, we're giving some insight into each other, into what's being seen. I know we're starting to see more claim denials just based on AI, for example, the use of AI, and they're not always accurate. So I'm really keeping an eye on that, looking to see what this is going to mean for our industry. All right, well, that is it for today's episode, and we'll be happy to have Michelle back next week in the studio, and I hope you all have a good week.